One of my favorite things about playing through video game sequels is getting to see the characters from the previous entries again and discovering the new role they're going to play in the story and or the game. Because depending on what kind of character we're talking about, apart from just nostalgia, there are usually some other thoughts going through your head which include but are not limited to, well hey buddy old pal, how have you been? Or, well shit, now I have to deal with this fucker again. Recurring characters have been used in games in a variety of interesting ways, and it's always been very cool to me how if this is done well, it can not only make said character a lot more memorable and iconic, it can also somewhat alter the experience of a returning fan from that of someone who's new to the series. And that's what this video is gonna be all about. It's worth noting that I'm mostly referring to NPCs regarding this topic, although it doesn't necessarily exclude playable characters, just that you know, I couldn't really think of anything interesting to say about playing as Mario for the 100th time. Also, there are going to be spoilers for all these games on the screen, so if you care about those, please vacate the vicinity of the monitor. Maybe go outside for a while. When it comes to recurring protagonists, there are a lot of little things here and there that might trigger your nostalgia, like their movesets or abilities, and it's always really cool to see how these things evolve throughout a series. In more story-driven games, it's also very interesting to see how the protagonist reacts to new situations while keeping in mind the things that they have been through before. But there's usually a much lower level of excitement from getting to play as a recurring protagonist because they're usually the face of the series, and when a new game comes out, you're most likely already expecting to be able to play as them again. Like, whoa, you play as Super Mario in this game? What the heck? However, one game that I've played recently that managed to be the exception to this is Yakuza 4. For the first few hours of the game, you play as this new guy called Akiyama, and although Kiryu, who's the main protagonist of the series, is mentioned 1 or 2 times, he's nowhere to be seen during the entire first act. The game kind of subverts your expectations a little bit because he's clearly there on the box art, so you know he's definitely in the game, but now that you've seen that you don't play as him anymore, you start to wonder what kind of role he'll have. When you eventually progress into the second act of the game with Saejima, you'll see a scene of him being transferred to a prison in Okinawa, which if you've played Yakuza 3, might turn some light bulbs on in your head, not just because it's an actual place in Japan, but also because someone pretty important lives there, aka Mr. Main Character, aka Dogma's Dragon, aka Kazumo Kiryu. And when you wash up on this beach later on, you'll probably also go, well hey, well, I know this place. And because of the anticipation that's been building up over the course of the game till this moment, when the man himself finally shows up, you might get this irrational excitement and hype, even though you already knew he was going to show up sooner or later. By the time you reach this point of the game, you've also probably pieced together that all 4 characters on the box are playable, which again builds up this anticipation towards being able to play as Kiryu again. So when you finally reach the last act of the game where you get to control him, it's like, aw shit, I get to play as a big man now. I guess the point I'm trying to get across is that by challenging your preconceptions of who you play as in the game, and taking advantage of your anticipation and suspense, Yakuza 4 is able to make it exciting to be able to play as Kiryu again, even though you've already played as the guy for 3 whole games. A common character type you'll see in video games is someone that's like a guiding light for the protagonist and is there to regularly provide the player with help along their journey. Having these characters reappear throughout multiple games in a series is a really effective way to not only remind you that the game is taking place in the same universe, but also helps you feel more attached to the characters themselves. Igor from the Persona series is a good example of a recurring character that guides the player throughout the course of the entire game. If you've played a Persona game and are starting a playthrough of another game in the series and see Igor again, you'll probably think something like, hey, this guy took really good care of me in the last game, so he's probably gonna be a homie in this game too. And if you've paid enough attention, you'll know that there are certain things he always does and says. He always gives you the key to the Velvet Room, and he always helps you fuse your personas with this card magic shit. He also has a lot of iconic lines at the start and end of every game he's in, and if you're like me, you'll probably also have a similar reaction to this upon hearing them.
My own duties end here as well. You were truly a remarkable guest.
Yes! Yes, I knew he was gonna say that! He says it in every game, yes! Yes!
But what's really interesting to me is the way Persona 5 used this knowledge that returning fans would have about Igor for some pretty gnarly foreshadowing. If you've never played Persona 5, all you need to know is that the Igor you interact with throughout almost the entire game is actually, as what many gamers in 2021 like to say, an imposter. And there are actually a lot of details that hint towards this twist that only returning fans would be able to notice. Apart from, obviously his voice is different, although he does the same introduction and serves the same purpose, there are a lot of other things that are a little off about this Igor. For starters, hello, where's my fucking key? How am I supposed to get into the Velvet Room without a fucking key, stupid? Also, why am I in prison? The other Velvet Rooms were really nice. You had a fucking limo, by the way. Also, why are these little girls killing my personas to fuse them? That's not how I remember how it's done. So when the game finally reveals that that isn't actually Igor, you go like, oh, that's why. It also made for a really powerful moment at the end of the game where Lavenza finally hands you the key after everything you've been through. Tom Nook is in every Animal Crossing game, and although his role has kind of evolved a bit throughout the series, maybe in kind of a questionable way, because he may be involved in using child labor, he's always the guy you go to for stuff about your house, and he's usually one of the first characters you meet and shows you how the game is played. So whenever you start a new Animal Crossing game, you can always count on him to be around to help you out. And also plunge you into a crippling debt. And even though Animal Crossing has a shitload of recurring characters, if you think about the most iconic ones, it's almost always going to be Tom Nook, Isabelle, and KK Slider. KK Slider does not really fit in this category. Get him out of the video. The last type of recurring good guy I'm going to talk about is the side allies that aren't super important, but are still always around to help the player in some way. Andre reappearing as the blacksmith in Dark Souls 3 was a nice way of providing fan service to people who played Dark Souls 1, because he serves as a small reminder of what they went through while playing as the Chosen Undead, and how valuable Andre's help was in the first game. In Persona 4, there's a short part where you visit Tatsumi Port Island, which is where the events of Persona 3 took place. You also get to see Chihiro, who is one of the social links in 3, and visit some old places like the school and the nightclub. Apart from being a cool throwback to the previous game, this segment is also a really nice way to just let old players know that all their friends from the last game are still doing fine. Which is really nice to know, because I know I definitely wasn't very fine after seeing the ending of that game. The characters I'm going to talk about in this chapter don't really fall under the category of good because they aren't exactly your allies 100% of the time, but they don't fall under the category of bad either because they're also not 100% evil.
He says that he's an a-hole, but he's not, and I'm quoting him here, 100% a dick.
GLaDOS was a really funny and likable antagonist in Portal 1, but I found her role in Portal 2 to be much more compelling. Villains becoming allies or being forced to work together with the protagonist might be my favorite device for character development in a story. After you accidentally revive her at the end of Chapter 1, things kind of revert back to how they were in Portal 1, where GLaDOS forces Shell to do a bunch of tests while saying a bunch of snarky shit. But just as she's about to kill you in Chapter 5, Wheatley comes in and saves you, which begins the whole sequence of events that leads to him taking over the facility and going mad with power. So now Shell and GLaDOS have no choice but to cooperate in order to stop Wheatley, because Shell wants to escape and GLaDOS wants her facility back. For the rest of the game, your interactions with GLaDOS become a bit different from what you know because she's no longer in power and basically has to rely on you to move around now that she's a potato.
I can't move, and unless you're planning to saw your own head off and wedge it into my old body, you're going to need me to replace him. We're at an impasse. So what do you say? You carry me up to him and put me back into my body, and I stop us from blowing up and let you go. No tricks. This potato only generates 1.1 volts of electricity. I literally do not have the energy to lie to you.
You also learn a few things about her backstory, like how her AI was originally based off of a person named Carolyn, and as you progress through the rest of the game, you start to feel like you know her more and are a lot closer, not just because you learned all this extra shit about her, but also because she feels like a real person that you've managed to put aside your differences and work together with.
Look, even if you think we're still enemies, we're enemies with a common interest. Revenge. You like revenge, right? Everybody likes revenge. Well, let's go get some.
It's also just really cool to have her on your side, because she's really funny, and at the end, her decision to spare and set Shell free, as well as the lyrics of Want You Gone during the credits, really hit home for me that it wasn't just me, the player, that got attached to her because of the struggle we went through. No, this fictional-ass character, not even a real person by the way, managed to convince me that she genuinely cares about me and is grateful for the things I did for her in a fucking video game. This is what truly made her an unforgettable character for me, and I think the reason it had so much weight is because I'd seen two very different sides of her over the course of the 2 games she was in and watched her character develop and grow. Because if this was the GLaDOS from Portal 1, then Chell is probably 100% dead in this situation. I know I've already talked about a Yakuza character earlier, but this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't include one of the most interesting recurring characters of all time, who is a very prominent character throughout the Yakuza series, and that character is Gary Buster Holmes. I'm kidding, of course it's Majima. Majima's role throughout the series is probably best described as that of an anti-hero because although he clashes with the protagonists fairly often and has a very different outlook on life compared to someone like Kiryu, he ultimately ends up helping you in some way. And although Majima has played many cool and intriguing roles across the games he's appeared in, what I really want to talk about is the way Majima was used in Yakuza 7. In that game, you spend almost 80% of it in a completely new area, and although there are many throwbacks and side characters you would recognize from the old games, the big boys are only very briefly mentioned here and there, and you don't get to see them at all. So when you reach the late game, if you're an old Yakuza fan, you probably have one of two mindsets towards seeing the old protagonists. One, you've given up on seeing them and have just accepted that they're not in the game, or two, you're still clinging on to that small shred of hope that they're somewhere out there and are going to appear at least once towards the end of the game. And when you're exploring the Omi Alliance headquarters in Chapter 12, after finishing what seems like the final encounter in the area, this happens. Regardless of which mindset you had, I think it's needless to say that if you are a returning fan playing this game, you probably lost your fucking mind when you watched this scene. So after a short exchange between the two parties, the game throws you into a boss battle against Majima, and as you hear the start of his theme song with the iconic vocals, you probably feel emotions such as excitement and nostalgia, but then you see the level counter above his head and start to realize, oh shit, oh fuck, oh no, I'm not fighting him as Kiryu anymore. Majima is the most noticeable difficulty spike in the entire game, and I think it's super cool that his fight was implemented this way because it canonically makes sense that he would be completely over your level. This is the same guy who single-handedly stormed the office of one of the most dangerous Yakuza families in Japan in 1988 with nothing but a knife and a baseball bat. Of course he's gonna fucking kick Ichiban's ass. I mentioned this briefly in my Yakuza 7 video as well, but another reason this fight is so great is that the attack animations Majima has are all from the old games that he was in, and returning players would be able to recognize them and know the timing to perfect guard them, which is such a cool ass way to reward old fans. Kiryu has a boss fight after this that's great as well, but there's kind of a build up towards his, and I think the reason Majima's left a much larger impression on me is because of the initial shock and excitement of just suddenly encountering him in the Omi HQ, which is like the last place you'd expect to find him. Combine this with how challenging and intense this fight is, and you have one of the best boss fights I've ever seen in a video game. When I first played this fight, I was honestly hoping that it was one of those scripted, supposed to lose fights because the prospect of Ichiban defeating Majima in a fight is so unlikely, and so yeah, Ichiban fucking dies. Dark Souls 3 pays a lot of homage to Dark Souls 1 in terms of its characters as well as its areas, but I especially love what they did with the Soul of Cinder and how they paid homage to Gwyn, who was the final boss of Dark Souls 1. Now, for those of you who aren't as acquainted with the Dark Souls lore as I, the Soul of Cinder is meant to be an amalgamation of every Lord of Cinder that has linked the First Flame before, in order to preserve the Age of Fire. If you didn't understand a single word of what I just said, basically, in Dark Souls, the world is dark, so to make it not dark, they need fire, but for this fire to keep burning, it needs people to link it, which really just means sacrificing their bodies to become fuel for the flame. In Dark Souls 1, there are two notable people who do this, Gwyn, who is the final boss of the game, and the Chosen Undead, which is you, if you choose that ending. The Soul of Cinder is essentially meant to be the combination of everyone who has sacrificed themselves to keep this fire burning, which obviously includes these two. What's beautiful about this fight is that the game doesn't ever explicitly tell you who this is, apart from just a simple name at the bottom of the screen that says Soul of Cinder. But when you reach the second phase of the fight, not only does his moveset become strangely familiar, the music also changes and starts to play these three distinct notes that you might recognize if you played Dark Souls 1. These two details, as well as the fact that this fight takes place in the exact same location as the final battle in Dark Souls 1, are such a great way of showing the player that this is Gwyn instead of just telling them by slapping his name on the fucking health bar, which leads to players arriving at their own conclusions as to who this boss is, and coming to that realization is one of the most satisfying things you can experience, period. I've been playing video games for a long ass time since I borrowed my friend's copy of Plants vs Zombies when I was 10, but this was legitimately the first time I ever recognized a character purely from their fighting style. And regardless of what you think of Dark Souls 3 and how it compares to Dark Souls 1, I think we can all agree that Soul of Cinder's second phase was one of the most memorable things in the series. Yuga Ganon was the first time I ever encountered Ganon in my whole video gamer life, and when he started doing this attack where he charges up this big ball and fires it at you, my first instinct was to just avoid it and try to hit him, which to my surprise at the time was a completely ineffective strategy. So naturally I was really confused because during this phase of the fight there is seemingly no way to damage him, and after a few failed attempts I decided to search up a walkthrough on how to beat him, which is when I learned that you have to hit the ball back at him over and over again until it damages him. What fascinates me about this is that hitting Ganon's ball of energy back at him is actually a recurring mechanic in many versions of his boss fights, but you would only know this if you've played or seen enough Zelda games. And looking back at my first time encountering him is funny because now whenever I fight Ganon in a Zelda game, if he ever charges up a ball and throws it at me, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And I think it's really interesting that even though Ganon is a villain you're supposed to see as an enemy, there's still this sense of familiarity fans have with him and how his fights work, because although every version of him is usually different in a variety of ways, there are some rules and things that remain constant throughout all the games he's in, which might not seem very obvious to players who are new to the series, but are almost second nature to old fans who've beaten many different versions of Ganon. There are many other notable examples of this, like how in many 2D Mario games you have to beat Bowser by pressing a button behind him that destroys the floor underneath him, or even some less obscure mechanics like how the Death Egg robot always has an attack that shows you this target thingy. I guess the point here is kind of the opposite of how it was with the Soul of Cinder, where instead of recognizing the character through the way they fight, in these boss fights against iconic villains you're able to anticipate how they will attack you and how to beat them because you know who they are. The last character I want to talk about is Patches from the Soulsborne series, who is basically this bald dude who tricks you into doing something by promising you treasure or a reward, and then immediately fucks you over. There are many different iterations of him from Demon's Souls, all the way to Dark Souls 3, but throughout every game one thing remains constant, which is that he's a fucking asshole. And if you've experienced getting screwed over by him before, whenever you see a bald guy with a friendly English voice with the name Patches in a Miyazaki game, you already know that this guy's bad news and that you should only follow his instructions if you're okay with dying, without the game even telling you shit. Which is kind of a strange but cool way of rewarding returning players, because if you've never played a Soulsborne game before, then you might be more willing to trust this guy and get you some of that sweet treasure. Although I'm kind of realizing now that a lot of bald characters in video games are kind of evil in some way. I guess Kratos is pretty nice in the new game. I realize that the examples I used throughout this video aren't the most diverse, but I also didn't want this video to have a bunch of spoilers for too many games. But nonetheless, if you watched all the way till the end and are hearing this, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I hope you managed to take something away from this video, or were at least a little bit entertained by it. And if you really enjoyed this video,
Like and share this with two of your friends. And leave a comment on your favorite character.
But seriously though, any likes and or shares would be greatly appreciated. As of now, the channel is pretty near to 400 subs, so kinda wanna see if we can reach that. I know my content has been kind of all over the place, but video essays are the main thing I plan to make this channel about, so if you're interested in that at all, then you can hit the subscribe button. I hate saying that. This video was a lot more broad compared to the topics I've talked about before, and it probably wasn't perfect, so any constructive feedback is also greatly appreciated. As usual, if you have a suggestion or whatever topic you want me to try to talk about, you can leave it in the comments. And I think that's all, so until we see each other again.